Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel. So for today's video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different, a little bit fun, and I'm actually going to be reviewing a comic run of Star Trek. Now this review was sponsored by one of my Patreons over on my Patreon page, so if you want to get me to review a comic book run, a movie, or a TV show episode, you can go over to my Patreon and donate at the Admiral level, and I'll be able to do one of these types of videos for you. So that's my little Patreon pitch, but for today's episode, I'm actually really excited to be reviewing this run. It's going to be the Peter David run on the DC Comics Star Trek line. He did a run for about 6 or 7 issues. I forgot the exact number right off the top of my head. Colloquially, his run is known as Who Killed Captain Kirk, because he basically has one sort of story through line that kind of culminates in the supposed attempted murder of Captain Kirk. Now, for those of you who don't know, Peter David is actually a well-known Star Trek writer. He's actually written for Star Trek in many different ways, most notably for the Star Trek New Frontier book line featuring Captain Calhoun and Commander Elizabeth Shelby. It was one of the first Star Trek book lines that really was sort of its own thing, separate from like actual ties to like a series like Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, or Voyager. There may have been some other ones here and there, but I think that was sort of the first big ongoing series to really do that. Peter David's also written a bunch of other books. He wrote, I think the first Star Trek giant novel, I think that was how it was branded, called Vendetta, that sort of dealt with the Borg and the Doomsday Machine. It was a really sort of fun series there. He's also written a bunch of his own books and for other series as well, but for my encounters with him, he's mainly known for being a Star Trek novelist and also a comic writer. Now, one of the fun things about Peter David that I really always kind of enjoy about his style, and it's a really kind of a love it or hate it with Peter David, is he's very, irreverent, I think is probably the best word to use for him, or at least very humorous. A lot of his stories and style has a little bit of an irreverence for sort of Trek lore and whatever tales he's dealing with. Not in the sense he's like, oh, I'm gonna break canon or whatever, but that he like gently pokes fun at some of the more like stilted or stifling aspects of certain characters. Like, for example, one of my favorites is like Captain Mackenzie Calhoun in the Hidden Frontier series. Is just a captain who's like, I don't give a crap about whatever. Like, I think he beats the Kobayashi Maru by blowing up the Kobayashi Maru ship and saying, well, it was obviously a trap by the Klingons, so I just killed them and then got away so I could save my crew, which is like not the thing you're supposed to do. And then there's also like little moments of just like him being just super weird and strange and offbeat. Like, I remember in one of his Star Trek books that I don't particularly like, but it's one of the post-Next Generation, Star Trek Nemesis novels, he has, like, the Borg cube eating Pluto in, like, a weird thing, and there's this whole funny discussion about, like, oh, was Pluto really a planet? We don't really know. He just has that sort of, like, weird sensibility, and that definitely comes across in this comic run. And I also should mention this comic run was done by DC Comics, and it also featured Tom Stutton doing the penciling, and then Ricardo Villagran doing the inking, Gordon Purcell doing a little bit of the penciling as well. So to dive into these actual comics, one of the things that I really love about reading Star Trek comics, and I'm actually part of the Star Trek graphic novel collection, which you can get from Eaglemoss. This isn't sponsored by them. They send you like 2 comic graphic novels of Star Trek throughout its history in a really nice collected case, or a collected book. And I really like getting those because what I find interesting is the comics are sort of like interesting artifacts that sort of, depending on when they were published, you can kind of see different avenues that Star Trek could have gone down in canon, like different things that, you know, never really showed up in canon or like were changed for canon, but at the time that these comics were written, you could do that sort of stuff. Like, for example, in this comic run, one of the characters on the ship is a Klingon. He's actually a Klingon who has come into Starfleet. There seems to be a lot of backstory with him in it, and I haven't read the previous comics in this run particularly, so I'm sure there's like reasons that he's in Starfleet. They kind of allude to it in this. But obviously, as we all know, in canon, Worf was, from what I remember, the first Klingon in Starfleet. So having a Klingon back in the 23rd century doesn't make sense by canon, as we know now. Well, you could do stuff like that. And there's some even more like egregious, funny examples that you can see. Like, for example, I believe in the initial Star Trek The Next Generation comic run, way back, that came out around the same time the show was even started, there was even like an arguing couple on the bridge of The Next Generation, that one of them had like a cape that was like flowing, and it was sort of like them going like, oh, we know that there's going to be families on the ship, so I want to have like a bickering couple. And it was just like some weird stuff. You could even go all the way back to, I think the most like egregious and hilarious are are the and most infamous are the Gold Key comics, where you have like the Enterprise has the warp nacelles are rockets instead of like warp nacelles, so there's like flames coming out of the back of the Enterprise to propel it, or like Spock being much more yelly and everything being much more like 1940s serial sci-fi rather than like Starfleet, like we're gonna try and protect life. They're like, we're gonna shoot everything. In the Gold Key comics, which is, it's just fun to read comics that way and to just sort of see like, oh, this is like a legitimate avenue that Star Trek could have gone down, but for, various different reasons in the writer's room and, whatever decisions they made, they just didn't go that way. But it's nice to have these like interesting artifacts of story that you can kind of play with that. And I found that particularly interesting in this case. Like, for example, there was the aforementioned Klingon, but then you also get some like interesting stuff in this comic of like Maress and I forget the other alien, but Maress is the one I particularly remember from the Star Trek the Animated Series, being part of the TOS crew in the movieverse. So they're wearing the like Wrath of Khan like red strapped uniforms, but they're the animated characters from the animated series, and so you can kind of put them into this world. And I really kind of enjoyed that was something that they could do in this comic. So I guess I should give a little bit of a brief overview of the plot of these books before I sort of get much further. I'd still recommend reading them because they're kind of funny, but basically the plot is there's a few different storylines going on. The first issue features a bachelor party for the Klingon character, the aforementioned Klingon character, and he's getting married to a human woman, and sort of this big bachelor party's going on, and Captain Kirk's like approved it, and everyone's just having a good time. But during the party, everyone's kind of bored because it's a dry party. No alcohol is allowed, as should be per Starfleet, unless you're on the Discovery during a war, which then you can get kind of crazy apparently. But on the ship, there's no drinking. So Scotty, McCoy, and Chekhov all decide to spice up the party and spike the punch in different ways. So they each slip in like their own particular vodka. Like Chekhov puts in vodka, of course. McCoy puts in Romulan ale, of course, and Scotty puts in scotch because duh. And they each put it in their own, and just causes everyone to get wild and drunk and go crazy, and eventually leads to a confrontation between the Klingon bachelor and a bigot who's in Starfleet named Bearclaw, who is a bigot against Klingons and doesn't really like Klingons at all. And this sort of sets off a storyline throughout the entire arc of Bearclaw basically coming at odds with Kirk, and Kirk being basically saying, "You're a bigot. I don't want you on my ship. You're being transferred off the Enterprise," and Bearclaw kind of being resentful of that. And then he becomes later on the top suspect in the attempted murder of Captain Kirk later on in this story, which I find interesting because again, going back to that changing of canon stuff. Captain Kirk was himself a bigot against Klingons in Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, which was, again, understandable based on, how they killed his son. So it's interesting in this version of the comics, which came out before that movie, that, Kirk had no problems with Klingons and didn't sort of have that internalized bias towards Klingons within the story. At least it didn't come up. And so it's interesting that Kirk in this story is being very much like, Bearclaw, you can't be bigoted towards Klingons, when later on the character would become that. So that's some interesting sort of like slightly off-putting canon stuff there that I found really interesting. Going into the story more, there's like a Klingon colony that gets attacked by a mysterious ship that looks like the Reliant. It's the same sort of Starfleet ship as the Reliant, but it apparently has a cloaking device, and no one really knows where this crew has come from. And they eventually learn that it was being captained by this captain who they find dead, and so they're like, his body has been dead for longer than the Reliant has been attacking ships, so they're sort of wondering, oh, how can, this captain that's attacking Klingon outposts have been dead, but then also leading this ship? So that's a big mystery there. And then in the middle part of this story, there's a wonderful sort of diversion into one of the crewmen who is a psychic, sort of gets drunk. I wasn't entirely sure. There was something sort of off with him. He was sick or something like that, and it causes the whole crew to hallucinate that they're going through the Divine Comedy, that they're going through the several layers of hell. And so Kirk, Spock, and McCoy sort of have to go through the entire story of the Divine Comedy in search of stopping these crew members, because they're sort of seeing the Enterprise as hell, which was sort of an interesting way to sort of get into the Divine Comedy, and kind of goes to Peter David's sort of more comical sensibilities. And then the final story is, of course, someone attempts to murder Captain Kirk and looks like Bearclaw, and eventually we learn that this is the same shapeshifter that was, that was in control of the Reliant type ship and had sort of snuck aboard the Enterprise and was trying to get back at Captain Kirk. And we eventually learned it was Garth of Izar, who I believe appeared in one of the original series episodes. I don't remember the episode all that well, but I do know the Garth of Izar sort of has like shape-shifting powers. He was like a Starfleet captain who kind of now has a grudge against Kirk. Again, kind of very reminiscent of Wrath of Khan, but with sort of like a shape-shifting twist on it. So a lot of fun in all of those stories and aspects. And like I said at the top, I think Peter David has this really irreverent style throughout all of it. So there's some like really wacky, weird stuff. I think first off, the bachelor party gets kind of strange and weird. But we also get like moments where I think part of the reason that Kirk's life gets saved towards the end of this series, the shapeshifter changes into this captain who can't come on to investigate the murder, and Kirk has sort of like a rivalry from them from the academy days that they used to play practical jokes on each other. So the reason this guy pretends to be that captain is about to stab Captain Kirk again, and Kirk sort of has a giant punching box glove in his closet that punches this guy. He's like, "Ha, that was my practical joke to get back at you," and it saves his life. So it's just a weird like Kirk boxing glove thing. There's also a moment where, you know, when the different crew members are experiencing hallucinations because of the crew member who's sort of psychic. There's like a brief Bloom County cameo where you see like Spock and McCoy like turning into characters from the Bloom County like Sunday comic strips, which was just weird and bizarre and like a very strange crossover for Star Trek to have in like a canon story, but it feels very, very Peter David-y. Oh, there's also like a scene reminiscent of, there's an episode of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer where like Buffy and this other guy kind of get trapped having sex the entire episode, and they just can't stop having sex. That's sort of like the joke of the episode. And there's like a scene like that here in this comic run where the Klingon and the human get married, and they kind of go off to do, you know, their marriage thing in their room, and then this entire Divine Comedy, weird hallucinogenic stuff happens, and they're just having sex the entire time. So they just never notice. Like the end of the comic issue comes like, oh yeah, we didn't notice. We just thought that was part of what was going on. So it just kind of reminded me of that Buffy episode. And again, goes to Peter David's just weird comic sensibilities that sometimes feel very anachronistic in Star Trek, like the boxing glove, but, you know, sometimes you just gotta roll with it and just kind of being like, you know, this is weird and out there, but I just, you know, you gotta have fun with it. There's also some other like fun stuff going on in this story. Like I believe Maress, the character from Star Trek the Animated Series, has the hots for Sulu throughout this. So there's like a bunch of like little hitting on each other sort of stuff going on there that I kind of really enjoyed, and I would have liked to see Sulu end up with Maress. That would have been cool, but unfortunately we never got to see Maress in live action form during the TOS era. I believe we may have seen her species at some point in either the Kelvin films or Discovery. I'm not 100% sure on that. I hope we do or will at some point, because I kind of like her species and I like that character quite a bit. They're like perfect, like very Catwoman-esque. And so I always liked Maress a lot, and so I hope we get to see a little bit more of her species at some point in Star Trek, and we may already have, but, you know, I'd love to see, like, a prominent character like that. So it's kind of fun to sort of see her playing with Sulu here and kind of, like, having that flirty attitude with him, and sort of Sulu kind of being embarrassed and kind of pushing against it because he has his own internalized sort of, like, I don't want to be with someone who's not really a human, which is, you know, kind of touched upon here, and I wish had been expanded a little bit more, but again, there's only so much you can do within a comic, given how many pages you have, and I'm sure they would have developed it further had the comic gone on longer, but it was sort of an interesting little note to touch upon here that Sulu doesn't have a problem with, you know, other species, but sort of for himself doesn't want to date outside of his species, which is, in my opinion, a legitimate feeling, but, you know, it goes back to something that, like, I talk about with, like, trans people, like, why don't, you know, it's perfectly okay for someone not to want to date a trans person for different reasons, but, you know, in my mind, it's like, you should investigate those reasons. Like, why wouldn't you want to date a trans person? And I did a whole video on that, so go check that out if you're interested in that sort of topic. But it's sort of an interesting discussion to be had. It's like, you're allowed to have your own sexual preferences and things like that, but, you know, maybe it's worth engaging with why you have those preferences. And I like that sort of Star Trek and Peter David's run here sort of brought that up in sort of an interesting way. And yeah, I think there's like some really, really good stuff in here. Like I think when Kirk gets stabbed, there's an issue where he kind of goes through and just has like hallucinations of his life. Like he recalls David and being really upset at losing David. And there's sort of like a really heartbreaking scene with him just sort of, you know, as he's dying, he thinks he's about to die from the stab wound. He sees David and he thinks like, oh, I can maybe be with him. And it's kind of actually like really surprisingly heartbreaking. There's also a little bit of like a ghost Captain Pike, who you see at this point, and all we know about him is that he has the menagerie like sort of melted face, and so it kind of plays with that, and there's some really like disturbing imagery here. And I really have to say, for the artists, they did a really, really good job, especially with the Divine Comedy stuff when they're going through the different layers of hell. There's some really beautiful and interesting and intriguing art throughout this entire run, especially there. They really get to be a little bit more surrealistic. And I have to say, for the Divine Comedy, I haven't read the Divine Comedy, but I kind of know it just from cultural perceptions. But I think that this issue is actually a really good going through of the Divine Comedy and the several layers of hell. I think they even use in the in some of the text box the actual lines from the actual Divine Comedy itself. So it's kind of like an interesting way to sort of get if kids are reading the comic, or some people who aren't familiar with the Divine Comedy, to sort of like, oh, this is an interesting way to learn the Divine Comedy. And I think the person who asked me to review this comic run actually said that, this is how they got introduced to the idea of the Divine Comedy. So I really kind of enjoyed that. So if you're looking for like a way to read this Divine Comedy, but want to do it with the Star Trek twist, this is a great way to sort of learn that here. So yeah, I mean, I kind of like jumped all over the place and kind of touched upon different things that I really liked about this comic run. And I have to say, I really highly enjoyed it. There's a couple things I did want to touch on just briefly since I'm reviewing it that I found a little bit problematic in terms of like looking at this issue with a modern lens. And I think that goes to like with the time that it was written as well. And not to give it a pass, and I've always said like, I never give things a pass just because it was written at this time. So of course they would write things like this. I never like using that as an actual excuse to sort of excuse some more, problematic parts of a work. But so that's why I'm just going to touch upon them here. There's like a moment where I think they make reference that a woman is pregnant, and she's like saying, oh, pregnant women get rotated out of Starfleet. And again, as we know today, like, how the treatment of women and sort of like women and professional jobs and maternity leaves, it's sort of like an ongoing discussion in our society today. But I tend to err on the side of like, we need to treat women with respect, and they shouldn't be like rotated out of their position just because they're now mothers. It's sort of like putting that burden onto them. But that's a larger discussion for this video, but something that I sort of like kind of felt uncomfortable with while reading the comic, but it was sort of a throwaway line and not sort of a big deal. And then I also did kind of have a problem in this run with just the women characters in general. Most of the women characters, while I did enjoy some of the storylines, like Maress having the hots for Sulu, and the sort of Klingon human-woman marriage stuff going on, pretty much, I think exclusively all of the female characters in this story were dealing with men and like have their relationship with men, like actual like romantic relationships with men in some way, shape, or form, and didn't really have any stories of their own. Now, I haven't read the entire DC Comics run, so that may not be a problem across its entire run, and certainly I think Peter David has written some really wonderful women in other book series, like he's done a great job with Shelby in the Hidden Frontier novels. But I did find it a little bit egregious that during his entire run in the DC Comics one here, that the only women characters that we get are kind of like having the hots for other characters. Like, I think there's even a scene at the bachelor party where the women kind of come in and like, be all sexy and stuff like that, instead of like hitting on the other guys. And again, there was no problem with it in and of itself. Like, I didn't really have an issue with how he did it. I just, for me, I would like to see more women doing more things. But again, that's kind of a problem with Star Trek in general, especially during the original series era, and has just progressively gotten better over time. That's basically my review. I really liked it. I think it's sort of a fun, weird take on the Star Trek universe, but actually has some really deeper, interesting themes and ideas going on within it in sort of the Peter David irreverent style that he has, that I kind of really enjoy. It's kind of one of those, like, you're either going to be on board for Peter David's style, or you're going to be kind of, taken aback by it and be like, no, this isn't really for me. And that's totally fine. He does kind of have his own unique voice within the Star Trek verse, but it's one that I kind of particularly have an affinity for, and I think a lot of people do. But if you have read this comic book run, what did you think about it? If you haven't read this comic book run, what are some of your favorite Star Trek comics? Have you read any Star Trek comics? Are there any that you like? I'd love to hear about it down in the comments below. I love reading Star Trek comics, so I'd love to hear people's thoughts on them. Would you like me to do more reviews of Star Trek comics? Let's hear all of that down in the comments. And as always, if you want to see more of my videos, make sure you hit the subscribe button and then the bell so you always get notified when my latest videos go up. And if you want to commission a review just like this, or you want to help make these videos even better than they already are, because I know they're fan-freaking-tastic, but we can even beef it up a little bit more so I don't have as much reverb as you might be hearing on the audio recording here, then please give to my Patreon page. It really means the world to me. It, like I said, helps make these videos better. It helps me, get some new equipment. It helps me pay the bills. It helps me do a lot of different things. So any bit you can do on my Patreon page really means the world to me, and I thank you for it. And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, Stephen Schuhart, Michael McGee, Maggie Evans, Lal Lindley, Wellington Marcus, Munir Amlani, and BBD. Thank you so much. It honestly really means the world to me, and the fact that you guys gave at this level, it honestly shocks me and humbles me, and just thank you so much to you and to all my other Patreons. But regardless of if you subscribe or you just sort of found this video out of the blue or you give to my Patreon page, I hope that all of you, in the end, as always, live long and prosper.